Hi folks, Lou here, and I'm going to talk about some of the aspects of warfare that commercial war games, at least, do not model or rarely model. I'm going to start out with a quote from a fellow who calls himself Quizmaster China. That was a comment on one of my videos. Quote, commercial war games tend to fail to model at all those aspects of war which are not considered exciting, such as supply, rest, training, landmines, obstacles, weather, even though training and supply are both key, even decisive factors in war, unquote. And he's absolutely right. But remember, commercial war games are not modeling warfare, they're modeling generalship. And so the uglier parts of warfare are often left out, and the players regard that as okay. And the result is that commercial war games rarely give the player anything like the problems that an actual general would have in warfare. Even so, we can say that the commercial war games model the exciting, or you might say sexy parts of generalship rather than the more mundane parts. And even we could say maybe the less violent parts. Who knows? I'm not counting the so-called war games that are actually resource management games, which is especially common in video, such as Hearts of Iron. In those games, you manage your resources right, you build up your production capacity, and when there's a war, it's more or less a formality because you have a lot more stuff and you have a lot better technology. Now, to give an example of the two most important aspects that Quizmaster China mentioned, a training example, Japanese pilots in World War II. The Japanese did not take their best pilots out of the line and have them train other pilots. Instead, they left them out there until they got killed. In contrast to that, the Americans took their pilots out of the line after something like 40 missions and had them train other people. And the result was that as the war proceeded, the Japanese pilots on average got worse and worse, and the American pilots maintained a level or even improved because they had the experience of all those veterans to rely on. And you get things like the Marianas Turkey Shoot, which had a much more one-sided result than would have occurred if the pilots had been relatively equal. That's not saying they weren't good Japanese pilots because they left them out there until they died. But as a way of training, it was a really bad idea. The Germans did the same thing, but it didn't affect them quite as much. And you had Germans who had ridiculous claims of a couple hundred enemy planes shot down, but there weren't very many of those guys. Now, supply is reflected in many war games, commercial war games. Sometimes it's just cutting somebody off. Sometimes it's more complex than that. And we can see in contrast Russia's problems in Ukraine, both early on and now. The Ukrainians have attacked their supplies, now with HIMARS and Storm Shadow, and the Russians are not experts at logistics anyway, and never have been. And consequently, they struggle to supply their people at the front. And that is a recipe for disaster. But supply is a tricky thing. I remember when I looked into the Battle of Bastogne, I discovered that after the initial fighting, which was dying down just as the 101st Airborne got there, the Germans decided to send their two panzer divisions onward, leaving one Panzer Grenadier regiment behind. And the result was that they were outnumbered, that the Allies had far more armored vehicles, they had far more artillery. The only thing that could beat the Allies was lack of supply. And that supply was airdropped. And fortunately, there was only one day when the weather was so bad they couldn't drop any supplies. Even then, at one point, the Allies were down to 20 shells per gun, even though they had far more guns than the Germans. The Panzer Grenadier Regiment did make a breakthrough, but then got surrounded and wiped out. The other people who were there, a broken parachute division and a Volt Grenadier division, they were not going to beat the odds. So if you're making a game there, what do you do about supply? Do you roll a die to see how the supply goes? Well, then the game can become a dice, determined by dice. Or you can decide that you're going to run something that's counterfactual and maybe